Hello and welcome back to our study on the great 19th century philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, the father of existentialism in modern philosophy. Um, it's based on my book on Soren Kierkegaard, Night of Infinite Resignation, and my name is Ross M. Bond. You can actually buy this book on Amazon.com. Just go to Amazon.com and do a search under my name, and you can buy the book. And hopefully, you've bought the book or you're going to buy it, and you can follow along with these series of studies. And we're now at number 16, believe it or not. And I think by the time we're done, we're going to have maybe 40, 50 studies, probably 50, because it just depends on how far you want to get into SK, and that's something we'll have to look at. But we do have to have a time limit, because there is only so much we can do on SK. So we were in our last lesson looking at SK's uh, uh, greatest work, uh, his work called The Concluding Unscientific Postscript to the Philosophical Fragments. And now this is his magnum opus and the greatest work he wrote in philosophy, and probably one of the greatest works ever written in philosophy. And we're looking right now at the objective question as to the truth of Christianity. And we left off with the proof objectively in book 1 of the postscript on whether Christianity can stand the test of time, whether you can base the truth or the proof of Christianity based on the centuries, because it's lasted now for 2,000 years. But could you base this durability of 2,000 years for an eternal salvation? Can I depend upon it just because it's lasted that long? And SK's answer is no, you can't. And why is that? It's because proof of the centuries does not give enough proof for basing an eternal happiness. For example, Islam has lasted since about the 8th century, and Judaism is even older than Christianity. But does that give us enough basis to depend on the proof of the centuries for any eternal happiness? And SK's answer is no. In the words of Johannes Climacus, no, this does not give us enough proof, does not give us enough certainty. So the argument of the centuries is pretty easily dealt with. And he doesn't go into it any further. It's just objectively you can't base an eternal truth on the proof of the centuries of a particular religion. The Hindu religion is probably older than Christianity and Buddhism. I'm not an expert on these religions, but they could be very well older than Christianity, but none of them can give a proof for the truth of these religions. So SK in the pseudonym Johannes Climacus pretty well disposes of that idea. And then the idea of the primacy, the infallibility of the Pope, which was proclaimed definitively in the 19th century. SK says that's a bunch of nonsense, as Luther points out over and over again. Nobody has to go into that. That's pretty much nonsense, silliness. It can't give us an objective basis for an eternal happiness. The Pope's the Pope, and he's got a big deal going on a lot of hubris in that and all that, but it doesn't give us any objective certainty of what the truth of Christianity really is. So he disposes of that. He doesn't pay any more attention to that sort of nonsense. The next chapter of the book, though, is really important because it deals with the speculative point of view, or another term is the higher criticism of Christianity, which was so prevalent in the 19th century and also in the 20th century. And in the 19th century, it became very common in the works of Hegel, of course, and Hegel was always SK's arch enemy, who he wanted to destroy, because Hegel thought he had a higher criticism of Christianity that could show a higher insight of speculative, of philosophical re-explanation of Christianity. And we have many other people who went down that road. And the book I use in reference is Myth and Christianity. An inquiry into the possibility of religion without myth, and religion in terms of sort of metaphysical, sort of philosophical or scientific understanding of what Christianity really is. And it's pretty pathetic if you're a Christian, but oh well. You know, and these people, I mean, you have D.F. Strauss. I have Georg Hegel, of course. You have Engels. You have Karl Marx, who called religion the opium of the masses and all that. And these people all thought they were smarter. Bruno Bauer, Frederick Engels, I mentioned. And then you get into the 20th century, and you have Rudolf Bultmann, you have Karl Jaspers. All these people think they're smarter than God, and they're not. And unfortunately, they come to this hubris, this satanic sort of thinking that, okay, I know more than God, I know more than Christianity. I can explain God in metaphysical, I can explain God in philosophical terms or historical terms like Rudolf Bultmann. But unfortunately, no, they can't. And the reason they cannot is because they cannot explain an absolute paradox. An absolute paradox is beyond reason. No matter how hard reason tries to understand what is absolutely paradoxical, it can't do it. And it shouldn't try. It's a waste of time. And that's what my next book on existentialism is going to be all about. I'm going to pick up on SK's understanding of existentialism and what he really meant by it, and correct all these misguided philosophers like Jaspers and Heidegger, and show why they never understood SK. But that's another book. Now, Johannes Climacus points out the goal of speculative philosophy is to so interpenetrate his knowledge of Christianity with thought that he is able to understand and explain it. But this is a profound misunderstanding, because Christianity is not a philosophical system. There's nothing. They can explain Hegel all they want. They can explain Plato or Aristotle all they want, but Christianity is not a philosophical system, but rather an actualization of inwardness. And only two kinds of people can know anything about it: those who, with an infinite passionate interest in an eternal happiness, base their happiness upon their believing relationship to Christianity, and those who, with an opposite passion, but in passion reject it: the happy and unhappy lover. It's an existential experience. It's not a philosophical system. Jaspers can study philosophical systems all he wants. He can study Hegel. He can study Plato. He can study Aristotle. That's fine. Great, wonderful. But when you go to Christianity, it's not a philosophical system to be understood in a process of logic. So he wastes all of his time, and all these people do. Rudolf Bultmann, the same thing. And I feel sorry for them because they wasted so much time to produce nothing. In the end, they produce nothing in their criticism of Christianity because from the very beginning they misunderstand it. It's an actualization of pathos and inwardness and not a philosophical system. It is a teaching to be believed or not to be believed. If you don't want to believe it, then don't believe it. I mean, Bertrand Russell wrote a whole book on why he's not a Christian. It's a big, thick book. I have it up here in my library somewhere, but I won't bore you with it. But he didn't have to write a book on why he's not a Christian. All he had to say, well, I'm not a Christian, I don't believe it, so fine. Okay, fine. You don't believe it, so you don't believe it. You don't need to write a book to prove you don't believe it. You either do or you don't. No matter how sophisticated you are, no matter how brilliant and absolute genius your ideas are in proving it or disproving it, it doesn't matter, because it's an absolute paradox. It requires belief, and it also requires a condition for believing, that is the born again experience. Otherwise, just forget it. Don't deal with it. Go on to history. Go on to Aristotle. Go on to Plato. Fine, great, wonderful. But leave Christianity alone. Let Christianity have its own place. Then forget it. Get over it. Okay, well, we have to go on. To try to understand Christianity as thought content is to try to understand something in a mode that does not exist, or rather exists only to a certain relative extent. In Latin, Johannes Climacus expresses it this way: Quidquid cognoscitur per modum cognoscitus cognoscitur. Okay, my Latin is not all that great, I have to admit, but what that means is whatever is known in the mode of the knower. Now, in philosophy, you know things in systems. You know things in logical constructions, such as syllogisms and sorites, but Christianity is an existential. It is it is found through the pathos of actually existing, not contemplating, not thinking, not proposing theoretical constructions, but in living, understanding what despair is, understanding pathos of life and despair, broken engagement, all the sorts of things that S.K. philosophized about. His philosophy is about really what he himself experienced in his life, his struggle with depression, his breakup of his engagement with Regina, etc. Now, you leave philosophy in its own sphere, and that's fine. If you want to go on philosophize all you want, that's fine. But don't mix up philosophy with Christianity, because you won't get anywhere. It's a waste of time, and I feel sorry for people like Jaspers and Bultmann, who wasted so much time trying to, and actually Bertrand Russell. It's pointless. Why did you waste all that much time? I don't know. But anyway, because they didn't understand the difference. And I wish they'd studied SK, and then they'd say, hey, philosophy has to leave it alone, pretty much. Okay, so, but this doesn't mean that the Christian thinker rejects philosophy or logic or clear thinking, as some people think. Just the opposite is the case. Such a thinker puts the realm of thought into perspective and associates circumspectly with philosophy without entirely rejecting it. The Christian philosopher realizes that there is no irreconcilable difference between reason and faith, but they each have their own spheres. And each should respect the other. The contradiction between the subject, who is in passionate and infinite interest in philosophical speculation viewed as something that might assist him, I shall permit myself to illustrate by means of an image from the sensible world. In sawing wood, it is important not to press down too hard on the saw. The lighter the pressure exerted by the saw, the better the saw operates. Excuse me. Now, if you put too much pressure in terms of reason in this analogy, then it becomes harder to saw. So reason has to be kept light in the Christian theology. Christian theology does not reject reason completely, but it puts it into its proper perspective. And therefore, the Christian philosopher makes himself light and doesn't try to impose reason on faith. Okay. So therefore, we're done with book 1 of the postscript. And now we go on to book 2. And we have, I think, about 15 minutes. Actually, 13 minutes to go. Okay, so having disposed in 32 pages of the objective problem of the truth of Christianity, S.K. goes into his, in the pseudonym Johannes Climacus, he goes into an analysis of the subjective problem, which is really the true problem of the truth of Christianity. Now, the second part, once again, continues the possible solution to the hypothesis that Johannes Climacus brought forward in the fragments and investigates the issue from a subjective point of view. And this part of the book, in this part of the book, Johannes Climacus gives a wonderful expression of gratitude addressed to the German philosopher Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, who was a major influence in all of S.K.'s writing. This expression by S.K. of gratitude is such a wonderful example of S.K.'s irony and against the so-called Hegelian system that I thought I would quote it extensively, and I do on page 158 of my book, which you can see right here. It's a long explanation. Hopefully you have a copy of my book and you can follow along. But in this gratitude that S.K. wishes to express, he points out how it was really Lessing who helped him understand the fallacy of Hegel's thinking. And Lessing and some of the other philosophers that he was in contact with were really instrumental in his works in the understanding of the relationship between reason and faith. And here we have in this whole quotation a beautiful explanation of what is often the case in the world when new ideas come into contact with the established order. And out of this confusion, the thinker finds inspiration from a predecessor. In this case, the new thinker is Soren Kierkegaard, and the predecessor was Lessing. So now, what did actually Johannes Climacus, the pseudonym that SK is talking through, learn from Lessing? Well, first of all, I refer to the fact that he was religiously shut up within the isolation of his own subjectivity, and that he did not permit himself to be deceived into becoming world historic and systematic with respect to the religious, but understood and knew how to hold fast to the understanding that the religious concern Lessing and Lessing alone, just as it concerns every other human being. And that's also an inspiration in my book that I go into in the preface as to how, in the words of Shakespeare, unto thine own self be true, and then it must follow as the night the day. Thou canst not be false to any man. The words that Polonius, as everyone knows, spoke to his son Laertes in Hamlet. So it's really a matter of subjectivity for each individual to decide by himself. And the decisions I make, I cannot impose on you. I can show you, I can tell you the decisions I found for myself, but then it's up to you whether you want to decide to believe it or you don't. You don't want to decide to believe it. It's a matter of belief or not belief. And each person has to go down that road that way by himself. Nobody can do it for you, but other people could show you what they have found. And then if you want to believe it, you want to follow it, it could help. And you should keep your mind open to it. This emphasis on subjectivity as the way to the truth obviously influenced SK throughout all of his thinking, as also did the lack of a result. He always rejected this idea of a result, like in Hegel. He saw truth as a way, and in this life, it is an infinite way. It's as long as we live in this life, truth is always a way and not a result. Much like Socrates, the emphasis on subjectivity led SK away from the objective tendency of the age. The more objective the world becomes, the more subjectivity tends to be submerged into objectivity. The greater the difficulties besetting the religious categories, which lie precisely in subjectivity. Hence, the tendency to become world historical, scientific, and objective with respect to the religious constitutes well-nigh an irreligious exaggeration. Now, what he's saying is, by forgetting the subjectivity, the inwardness of the life, and obsessing about the objective truths of history and nature, one tends to forget the subjective in terms of it, and instead follow some sort of a scientific or intellectual understanding of what truth really is. So SK attributes the following theses of his subjective thinking to Lessing. Number one, the subjective thinker must have a regard to the dialectics of the process of communication. This is a subject which we reviewed, of course, in our study of SK's very, very in-depth and complicated explanation of his indirect communication, because there is no direct communication between one human being and another regarding subjective thinking. For example, let's one example, an example in pathos is love. Love, for example. I can't directly tell you what love is. You have to experience what it is before you can really understand anything about it. So if I try directly to say, okay, this is what love is, and you memorize it, you probably don't understand a thing about it. So it has to be done indirectly. And so this was a big part of SK's whole authorship, which we covered in depth in the chapter on indirect communication. And so this was one of the first things that SK learned from Lessing, the great German philosophers. And I don't know why Germans are so deep thinkers, but you know, they are. They're very deep, and a lot of inspiration comes from a lot of German philosophers. But anyway, so we went into all that, and I'm not going to repeat that here. In SK's theory of indirect communication. The second principle that he learned from Lessing was that the subjective thinker is essentially negative in his thinking, in the sense that the truth is a way and not a result. The result must always be put off, so in the end there is no result, only a way. And we touched on that quite a bit already. And so it's always negative. It's always drawing you in. It's always opening up questions, avenues of thought. There's never a result. There's only a way. And it's true in Christianity itself that we're always progressing. We're always finding new things. If you study the Bible, you'll never exhaust it in your whole life. Even if you had 100,000 lifetimes, you would never totally exhaust all the thinking, because it's a way and not a result. The eternal or infinite is the only true certainty, but since the existing individual is still only an existing individual, he must relate to the infinite as a never-ending becoming, at least in this life, and thus the negative aspect is the thinking of the subjective thinker, and it's always in process of becoming and never can be complete in this time. And this is why the individual can never become sub specie aeterni. That's Latin from the means from the standpoint of the eternal. Because from the standpoint of the eternal, existence is finished, and God knows it. God knows the end from the beginning, but no man can ever possibly know that. The third thing is that accidental historical truths can never serve as proofs for the eternal truth of the reason. That the transition by which it is proposed to base an eternal truth upon historical testimony is a leap. And here we go back into the leap of faith. The leap of faith is the transition in the believer from non-belief to belief, and it can only be done by God. The condition to believe can only come from God, and if you don't have it, pray to the Holy Spirit and pray God that He gives you by the Holy Spirit the condition for believing and understanding the truth, because it only comes that way, through a leap. So historical knowledge with respect to an eternal happiness, and also it must be added an eternal unhappiness or hell, is totally insufficient to base one's hope on. For example, one might be willing to believe that Alexander the Great existed at one time based on historical knowledge, but who would risk on the basis of this belief something of such great and lasting significance? Oops, I'm a little bit over time. I only have 30 seconds. Okay. Well, okay, we're going to have to stop because my producer says I only have about 25 seconds. Okay, so in our lesson tomorrow, we'll pick up on this chapter on the subjective thinker in relationship to Christianity. I hope you join us tomorrow on page 163, and goodbye for now.